Hi, my name's Bryson, and welcome to Easily Entertained, a podcast all about covering all aspects of entertainment, being movies, books, video games, whatever we find entertaining here. And I'm just here to remind you to like this episode and to give us a follow so that you can be notified of all the latest episodes when they come out. I hope you enjoy this episode.
No, I am the Father.
And here we go.
That belongs in a museum!
Are you telling me that you built a time machine? Out of a DeLorean?
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
This is Sparta!
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Dr. Grant, my dear Dr. Sattler, welcome to Jurassic Park.
So, I don't like Citizen Kane. Now, if you're a huge film buff out there and you're like a film student or something like that, you may think I'm spitting blasphemy by saying this, but I don't think Citizen Kane is that great of a movie. And let me explain a little bit why. And I will a bit further on, but let me explain what Citizen Kane is to those who have never seen it or have seen it and it's just been a while, because sometimes it's an old movie and so you kind of have to explain it. So Citizen Kane, it was released in 1941, so it's pretty old. It was during like World War II, I think is when that one was coming out, I think around the start of it. And it was directed, produced, and starred Orson Welles, which, if you're a little bit familiar with entertainment history, Orson Welles made a very famous radio broadcast in 1938, which was War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It's no relation, it's different spelling. That kind of got his name out there. It grabbed attention from Hollywood studios. And so he had signed a deal with RKO Radio Pictures, which is a Hollywood studio, at least at the time. I don't think they're out anymore. But so they had him direct and produce his own movie. And so he wrote it by himself, I believe with a co-star. I can't remember exactly his name. So they made this movie, and here's the story. Act 1, the story. Charles Foster Kane, who is the main character, he's an owner of a very large newspaper company. The Inquirer, I believe is the name of it. And he dies. And this is at the beginning of the movie, and it's very famous if you've heard of it. He dies, and his last words are Rosebud, and it's a symbolization for something, but I'll get to that in a minute. And so this movie kind of starts sort of in medias res, which means the beginning of the movie is the end of the movie, but not exactly. People like to say that, but it's not exactly how it works, because the whole movie kind of goes through a bunch of backstory, so it's not exactly real medias res, because that would mean the clip that's at the beginning of the movie is at the end of the movie, and that's not exactly how Citizen Kane is. After he says his final words, Rosebud, an investigation begins with, I believe, like journalists from the company he was at, and they want to know why those were his last words. Was it a mistress? Who was it? They think it's a person most of the time. Someone goes off to meet with people to find out about Kane's past, to understand who he was as a person and figure out what Rosebud meant and why those would have been the last couple of words that he said before he died. And so that's basically the whole premise of the movie. And kind of subtext to that is a huge amount of commentary on the news industry as a whole, at least at that point in time. And it still kind of holds up to this day because news is still kind of acting this way. It kind of becomes more personal. It takes stances. At the very beginning of the movie, there is a title card that says that Kane would always have a stance, whether it be a person, like a celebrity or a political figure, or if it was political or social issues, he would take a stance. He would have that bias. He wouldn't be what the news should be, which is unbiased. News is supposed to be unbiased and supposed to cover both sides to give the people the information that they need to be able to make decisions for themselves. That's how it's supposed to be. It's really not how it is now. Now you have a lot of things that are leftist, Democrat, conservative, Republican, sometimes centrist, and it's kind of hard to figure out where you are on the political spectrum. And a good news studio will try and be as center as possible to cover both sides and not give any particular leaning to either side. AP Style typically tends to do this. I think so. I say AP Style, that's the way you write. The Associated Press typically tries to do this. They try to remain unbiased. However, it doesn't always end up that way. And so this movie is kind of a bit of a commentary on that and how the news can be kind of corrupted, and they can have influences from outside or they can be influenced from within in the case of Charles Kane. Like at the beginning of the movie, he wants an interview from someone whose wife is missing, Mr. Silverstone, I believe is his name. He says, get a detective over there to get some answers, and if he doesn't give us any answers about where his wife is, we'll mark him as an anarchist. And that's just threatening and blackmailing, even if the guy doesn't know. That's something that the news technically can do. They can ruin your name immediately. And that's something that should not be in the power of the media, because granted, although that they can do that if the facts are all there, they can still mark someone as a bad person even if all the facts aren't there. And so there can be that corruption, and kind of with corruption, you can buy reporters from other papers. They'll follow where the money is. And granted, that does happen today, and sometimes people just go just because it was a better opportunity, which is totally fine. But sometimes they are buying them from other papers to weed out the competition, kind of as a monopoly. I am not sure how much it is today. I should have looked up a chart, but you can often find ties of parent companies for these news outlets that all kind of lead back to one, which is basically monopolies, which is not good because that weeds out competition. Creativity kind of strives in competition, and information strives in competition. You get multiple sides rather than just two sides of each issue being presented, whether it's by like a bajillion different companies, but they all have the same side. That can be really controversial. And then that can also cause things to be engaged in politics, which in this movie, Charles Kane, as the owner of a large newspaper, he eventually becomes very engaged in politics, even running for governor, and he marries a president's niece. And so it shows that there can be a lot of corruption within news, and that is good to commentate on. It can be a very controversial issue because I feel like the news has so much power always. It's kind of always had that power. It can shift the tide with different issues, because you can think about like the recent 2020 election. People felt like social media, which is basically news at this point, could stray how things go. And it's not necessarily that case, but it's just because that's how information gets around. Maybe people with bigger followings have an opinion on politics that could lead some people other way because they have such a high opinion of this person, this influencer. There can be a lot of corruption, whether intentional or unintentional, within the news. And so that's kind of the basic premise of Citizen Kane, is like a bit of commentary on the news industry, and then also kind of figuring out that the person who owns this newspaper company is a bit more deep and involved than you should really have with the news. Act 2, the dislikes. And so I said that I dislike this movie, which a lot of people will probably hate me for, because Citizen Kane is renowned as one of the greatest movies of all time. For some people, it is the greatest movie of all time. It's all right. It's not bad. It's not amazing, but it's not the greatest movie of all time. I think that for several reasons. I have some film experience, like making films myself, like just short films, and I want to go into the film industry, and so I tend to notice things more often. I rewatched it today as I'm recording this, so it's a couple days before the episode, because I wanted it fresh in my brain. But the first time I watched it, I fell asleep. I don't fall asleep watching anything. I will actively turn it off and go to sleep, or I'll sit through the whole thing super tired, but I will never turn anything off unless I don't care for it. I didn't care for Citizen Kane the first time. I watched it all the way through this time. I didn't fall asleep just because I wanted to have more perspective on talking about this, but it was, once again, something that I don't think is a greatest movie of all time. But so at the beginning, we have a lot, and I mean a lot, of establishing shots. And by the way, we're going to get very film talky here, so I will explain some things as I go along because it's very technical. So an establishing shot means a shot that, as it sounds, establishes where you are. Typically, you want to do this in 1 or 2 shots. You want to very quickly let people know where you are in the story. It's usually it'll be outside of a house or outside of a location to establish where in the world the location is, and then you usually get a closer establishing shot that is usually in the building. This one had so many. I lost track of how many establishing shots I was watching. It was a fence, it was a building, it was a park outside of a building, it looked like a courtyard, whatever. It was giving too much establishing. And that may be a product of the time, because normally credits would be put at the beginning of a movie like that, but they didn't really have that in this, so I didn't understand the explanation as to why it would be there. And so it seemed to drag on. I felt like I knew where we were, or they could have cut out a couple of shots to make it shorter to quickly establish where we are and then get on to the story, because that's what we're here for. It's the story, which I think wasn't as great, but we'll get that in just a second. So it was those establishing shots that took way too long. And then immediately after kind of establishing where we are, we get the close-up of Kane's mouth, and he's like, Rosebud, and then it... done. We move on and we go to a newsreel, which kind of gives us exposition of what Charles Kane was. And this also had an issue of being way too long. In the context of the movie, it's meant to be a newsreel that's going to be shown to the public that summarizes who Charles Kane was. The newsreel itself was 15 minutes long, because you see all of it. It's not like they're watching it, they cut to people watching it. No, you watch the whole thing. By the end of the newsreel, we were about 15 minutes into the film. That seems too long for me, because at least in terms of modern standard, I don't know what things would have been like in the 40s, news is typically very fast-paced. We don't want things to drag out. We want them to be very clear and concise. I say this as I'm recording a podcast, which ends up being way longer than I technically would need it to be, but it's how it goes. But so news typically, compared to podcasting, should be very short. It should be very clear, very concise. That's not what this newsreel was. It explained every aspect of Kane's life, and I don't think that is good. And this falls under a thing that I've talked about several times before in previous episodes, is that it's the show don't tell rule. The exposition only tells. It does not show. I mean, it shows like with video, of course. It does not tell, it doesn't show us it doesn't let us figure it out for ourselves who Charles Kane was. It only tells us, because I mean, that's how the news is. It's going to tell you, and that makes sense kind of in the context of a story about a man who owned a news company, but it still feels out of place and too long. Because when you think news, you think short. It should be clear and concise. It should be wrapped up really quickly. Be like, this is who this man was, this is what he did, the end. Great. That's how it should go when it comes to news. But that's not what this was. By the end of it, I was like, man, that was such a long piece of exposition. And it kind of bugs me because as you go throughout the film, you discover more about Kane as a person. You talk to different people throughout the story that were big in his life. It'd be like Susan Alexander Kane, who was his second wife, or Leland, who he worked with. That makes sense. And you're going throughout and they explain who he is as a person. You get flashbacks that show him as a person. That is the show don't tell rule. A newsreel at the beginning that gives 15 minutes of exposition on who Citizen Kane was is telling us and not showing us. I think it would have been better had it been short, because again, news should be fast-paced. You should immediately know what the thing is. And that would have given good context as to the whole story, because it's news. It should be fast-paced, and you get like a very brief glimpse, like basically a very short obituary about this person. That's it. It's very like surface glimpse of their life. Then you go throughout the story and learn more about who he actually was. Instead of very surface level, you would go more in depth. The exposition with the newsreel felt like it was going in depth. It shouldn't feel like that. It should feel very surface level and let the story of the movie drive you forward. It should continue to catch your attention, which is why the story, I feel like, doesn't work. It doesn't grab your attention. It feels like it should be interesting, but at the same time, it's not. In an interview with Richard Elfman, he says,
Citizen Kane, okay, so he takes this brilliant cinematographer, gives him free rein, and does innovative shots, innovative editing, and has a really, really interesting film. But I have a simple test with film being great or comedy being funny. The film being great is how easy is it for you to turn it off? It is that simple. No rocket science. We've all got films that we don't want to turn off. We're late for the appointment, we want to keep watching. Those are our greatest films. I've never had trouble turning off Citizen Kane.
Basically what he's saying is that a movie should continue to grab your attention. You should not want to turn it off. It should always be on your mind. You should have 100% focus pretty much on a great film. Citizen Kane doesn't really do that. It feels like it should be interesting, because technically the premise of Citizen Kane is kind of interesting. Kind of a mystery, you get a bit of commentary on an industry that not a lot of people really know about, and that sounds like it should be interesting. When you watch it, it's easy to turn off at any point. You could turn it off and not really feel like you're missing out. You could turn it off and immediately go watch something else. That, I think, is what causes Citizen Kane to lack as a film, because it should grab your attention. You should want to stay in your seat and not move for the entire 2 hours of the film, but it doesn't feel that way. And it's kind of hard to explain why, because when you really think about it, there's so many good aspects to Citizen Kane. It should match up pretty well, but it doesn't. And you feel like something's missing. There should be something that catches your attention, but it doesn't. And that's why I don't think it's the greatest film of all time, and it's just good. Act 3, The Influence. All right, so let's leave on a bit of a positive note so that people don't hate me. So Citizen Kane actually was very influential for cinema. A lot of media references it very often in modern cases. You have shots that are almost exact. It does the medias res thing. It takes different concepts from Citizen Kane and uses them in modern context. And I think the two biggest things from Citizen Kane that were so influential was the cinematography and the editing. The way these two things work together, and the cinematographer, by the way, was Greg Toland. He did most of that stuff, along with Orson Welles. They kind of did a combination of it. And with this, they allowed skills that were used actually in previous films, but they applied them really well here. Angles were a really good example of this, using different angles to emphasize certain things. They used a lot of low angles very often to give Kane a sense of power, almost like you were looking up at him, a larger than life kind of setting, especially at a like political speech kind of event. He is talking about what he's going to do for the state, and they give him a low angle shot because this makes him larger than life. Like, he's standing up for the people and for what's right, and that's good for the character. It grabs that attention. It makes you feel like this character really is important. And along with the camera, they moved it quite a few times. They had a very smooth moving camera that didn't feel like it was handheld. It was definitely mechanical the way they would have done it, but it gives you almost a godlike perspective. It moves fluidly from different heights to different angles, going back, going forth. It moves around, and a moving camera is interesting. It demands that attention. It is something that you want to witness because you feel like you are partaking in the story. You're there with them. It's not just a static shot where you have to be like, I'm kind of just a bystander in this. You feel more in the moment if the camera moves. And another technical aspect of the camera was this thing called deep focus. And so typically when you think of most films, most of the time there is only one focus point of the shot. It's usually the person talking, or it's an item or a place. Like, you can have wide focus where like everything is in focus. That's technically deep focus. But even still, certain things in the far background are going to blur out. Things in the foreground are going to blur out. And so deep focus makes everything in focus. And you would feel like that would make things really cluttered. But the way you utilize it properly, like how Citizen Kane does do, is by making proper composition and framing to allow all aspects of the shot to be viewable and understandable from the viewer's perspective. A really good scene is at the beginning of the movie when Kane's mom is like signing over guardianship rights to the bank, to Mr. Thatcher, I believe was his name. And so you have a shot where she is with Thatcher at a table in the foreground, and she's signing something. You have the midground where there's Kane's father. And then in the far background, you have a window where just outside, Kane is playing outside in the snow. You can see all of this in crisp, clear focus. And that is deep focus. You can see it all while not being distracted by all of it. You can move your eyes around and not feel like something is particularly grabbing your attention. You can let your eyes wander and pick out the story for yourself, which is a good way to shoot with a camera. I think it's very interesting, and it lets you see it in a different light rather than the camera specifically telling you to look somewhere else. And then along with the editing, they were able to do some interesting things that I'm not sure exactly how they did it in the 40s, because I know how I would do it now in like Adobe Premiere where everything's digital. They have things like match cuts, which means you have two shots that are very similar in composition, and when you transition to them, it makes for a very smooth and interesting transition because now you're in a different location, but it feels similar because things are laid out in the same way. It's a very interesting way to change where you are. It helps a lot with location differences because it is so similar. It doesn't feel as jarring to transition because then you can move the camera after you've transitioned. And then they had a lot of fading and double exposures in this. And so having that is very interesting because I think at the time you would have been very limited by the technology that you had, because you would have, I believe, had to physically overlap tape to scan and then get that effect. Because like nowadays you could just turn down the opacity in an editing software. You couldn't do that because everything was physical back then. You had to come up with different ways to do it yourself. And so doing that in this, it's kind of interesting because to get those smooth cuts from different shots, they faded and did double exposures a lot so that things could appear from a different shot as they transitioned rather than just jump cutting to something else, which is an interesting way to do it. A big thing in this film was the camera telling the story. Really, you felt like you were a part of it, like I said. That moving camera, the low angles, the high angles, the fades, the camera was telling the story. And I think that's what Citizen Kane has going for it. And I think that's what a lot of people regard as making it the greatest film of all time, is because the way they made it was brilliant. It really was, because at the time they were limited by technology. They had to be very creative and innovative in the way they applied all these different skills that had been used previously. Orson Welles wanted to make his first directorial debut a good one, and he did. And I think that aspect of Citizen Kane is good. I think the story and the attention is what kind of needed more oomph to it. I think that's what kind of keeps Citizen Kane, for me, from being great, and it's just good. But it's kind of up for debate. It depends on the person. Some people are going to see it and be like, this is the greatest movie ever made. And I see it and I'm like, I don't think so. But, you know, it's kind of up for debate. It just kind of depends on what makes you very easily entertained. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Easily Entertained. If you enjoyed, be sure to tune back in Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, where we're available on all podcast platforms. And if you want all the latest updates on all things entertainment, check us out on social media for Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. And until next time, this is Easily Entertained.